Hi, this is Wiley Sharp with Dennison Yachting, and today I want to do a quick video on what spare parts I think every cruising catamaran should have on board. This is not a complete list. This to me is kind of like a baseline of what you should put on your boat when you buy your boat or when you're going to go do any extended cruising, that sort of thing. This is a reshoot of the original video because I forgot some pretty important basic items, but as a few of my captain buddies pointed out, the spare part you need the most is always the one that you don't have on board. So I think the list I'm going to give you right now is a pretty good starting place. I'll have that full list in the description down below, but let's go ahead and dive into it, breaking down by a couple different categories. So for your main motors on the boat, be it a Yanmar or a Volvo, here's what I would recommend carrying on the boat. I'd recommend having oil for 2 oil changes, 8 Racor filters or any other type of primary fuel filter. I'm partial to the Racors. I tend to carry a lot of Racors on a boat just because that will save you a lot of hassle and headache if you do pick up some bad fuel. I'd also recommend carrying 4 secondary fuel filters, so enough to change the filters on the motors at least 2 times. I'd recommend carrying 4 spare impellers, a spare starter motor, 4 oil filters, which is enough to do 2 oil changes. I'd recommend carrying 6 fan belts, a spare alternator, a spare exhaust elbow, because those actually tend to be kind of a wear item on a motor after a couple of years, and as soon as it starts leaking, you can swap it out and then just replace it. I'd also recommend enough coolant on board to flush the cooling system on both motors at least 1 time. I'd also recommend carrying Saildrive Oil as well as a replacement rear seal. Now, you're not going to necessarily be able to change the fluid or the rear seal while the boat's in the water, but it's always nice having that on board versus trying to stumble around at a boat yard trying to find those parts if you do have to do a last minute haul out. For the generator, very similar to the engine, I'd recommend enough oil for 2 oil changes, 4 Racor filters. So I usually buy them by the 12 pack because a lot of times it's the same size filter cartridge for the motors as it is with the generator. Recommend a starter motor. I'd recommend 2 to 3 spare impellers for the generator, 3 fan belts, spare alternator. In the Northern Lights generators, the control board can sometimes give way. So I would like to personally, I'd like to have a spare control or voltage regulator on board the boat, although that is kind of an expensive part. Enough coolant to flush it twice, exhaust elbow, I think I already said 2 impellers and a starter motor, as well as the alternator for the generator. For the rigging on the boat, I'd recommend having some seizing line, assorted spare shackles, a palm and needle with some sail thread, a sail repair kit, some like patches and whatnot, a few spare blocks, especially if you've got those Lumar plastic blocks, and spare line. Usually what I do if I change out sheets or halyards, I actually coil those up nicely and store them in a 4-peak somewhere because you can never have too much line on board a boat. When it comes to the electrical system, a lot of different spares I'd recommend carrying. I mean, you're going to want to carry your fuses, plenty of replacement fuses depending on what type you have on the boat, as well as electrical relays. Things like your motors need relays, your generator. I mean, just assorted relays is never a bad thing to have. Some assorted 12-volt wiring. You don't necessarily need the big heavy cable that you'd use to the alternator or anchor windlass, but having some spare 12-volt wiring, always a really good idea. An assortment of connectors, heat shrink, and I already mentioned relays. So I guess in the same vein of electrical, I'd recommend a spare float switch or 2, probably a spare bilge pump or 2 as well. For the plumbing system on your boat, I'd recommend, assorted PEX fittings if that's the kind of, plumbing you have on the boat or whatever type of plumbing you have, as well as some spare line or hose, varying size and length, that sort of thing. I'd recommend having a spare shower sump pump, a spare water pump, a spare air conditioning raw water pump, and then a rebuild kit for your heads, as well as a pump for your heads too. And then if you've got a water maker, having spare filters is never a bad idea as well. So those are kind of the main spares that I'd recommend carrying on a cruising catamaran. Like I said, this is kind of like a baseline of what you should have on board. You can never have too many spares, in my opinion. So once again, I'll have this full list in the description down below. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below, shoot me an email, and as always, if you like what I have to say, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Thanks, and have a good day.